At 22, Addie Winslow stood at the edge of the only road she had ever known, holding a rope leash in one hand, and the whole of her worldly fortune in the other. It was her stepfather, Silas Merrick, who had put her there, telling her plainly, in front of the hired men mending fence, that a girl with no blood tied to his name had no claim on his land now that her mother was 2 months in the ground. What she had was $14 sewn into the hem of her coat, a tin cup, and a red-coated hound named Copper, who pressed against her leg, as though he alone understood what had just been taken from her. With 12 of those $14 gone to a week's lodging and bread, she had exactly $1 left when she heard that the old Larkspur Hollow livery stable, condemned and shunned since its owner vanished 9 years before, was hers for the asking. Folks called it foolish, called it cursed, called it a waste of a woman's last coin. They did not know that beneath its rotted hay, something had been waiting 9 long years to be found, something that would not only remake Addie's fortune, but set an entire town right again. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Addie Winslow and her faithful dog Copper. If a story like this one warms something in you, we would love to hear which part stayed with you longest. Leave us a word in the comments, and let us know. Addie had been born Adelaide Fay Whitcomb in the spring of 1865, in a soddy 15 miles east of Larkspur Hollow, in the high grass country of the Wyoming Territory, where her father broke his back turning prairie into wheat, until the winter of 1871 took him with a fever no doctor in 3 counties could name. Her mother, Ruth, a quiet, capable woman with flour-dusted forearms and a spine like good oak, had raised her alone for 6 years on a widow's determination, and a skill she had learned from her own mother before her: the mending of harness leather, the stitching of saddle seats, the careful, patient work of restoring what other hands had ruined or worn thin. Ruth kept a little shop behind the house, no bigger than a stall, and by the light of a whale oil lamp, she taught her daughter to thread an awl, to soak and shape wet leather over a form, to see, in a cracked and blackened strap, not garbage, but a thing merely waiting to be made whole again. "Nothing is finished being useful, Addie," her mother would say, turning a broken bridle in her hands like it was a puzzle rather than a ruin, "until somebody decides it is." It was a lesson that would return to Addie many times in the years that followed, though she did not yet know how much she would need it. When Addie was 11, her mother married Silas Merrick, a widower with 300 acres, a bad temper he kept mostly hidden in company, and 2 grown sons from his first marriage, who never once looked at Addie as kin. Ruth married him, Addie came to understand only much later, not for love but for survival. A woman alone on the frontier with a young daughter had few enough choices, and Silas Merrick's acres were warm and dry and did not ask permission to keep her fed. For 11 years, Addie kept her mother's leatherworking skill alive in secret, mending tack for neighbors after dark, so Silas would not see it as an insult to his own hands, and it was in that same year, when she was 11, that a half-starved red hound pup came limping up out of the coulee behind the Merrick barn, one ear torn, ribs showing plain through his coat, and refused to leave her side, no matter how many times the hired men shooed him off. Ruth had wanted to turn him out. Addie had knelt in the yard dust and fed him bacon rind from her own supper, and something in the animal's dark, patient eyes had told her, the way a thing tells you before you have words for it, that he had chosen her the way she had once wished someone besides her mother would choose her. She named him Copper, for the color of him in the evening light, and from that day the 2 of them were rarely apart. Copper waiting at the shop door, while she worked leather by lamplight, Copper trotting beside her cart to town, Copper curled against her boots on the nights her stepfather's temper made the house feel smaller than it was. There was a particular evening Addie would return to often in memory in the years that followed, the winter she turned 16, when a farmer 3 miles off brought in a saddle so cracked and neglected that Silas himself had waved him toward town, saying it was fit only for the rag bin. Addie had taken it in secret, working 3 nights by lamplight, soaking the leather slow so it would not split, rubbing neatsfoot oil into every seam until the old hide drank it in like a thirsty thing, and on the third night, she had presented it to the farmer good as new, refusing payment beyond what he could spare. He had wept, a grown man in his barn coat weeping over a saddle, because it had belonged to his late father, and he had believed it lost for good. It was Copper, still barely more than a pup that winter, who had sat through all 3 nights of that work with his chin on her knee, and it was that same winter Addie first understood that her mother's lesson was not merely about leather at all, but about people, about towns, about anything the world had decided to call finished and worthless before its time. She kept that farmer's tearful thanks folded inside herself like a coin she could spend on courage whenever Silas's temper filled the house with silence instead of words. More than once in those years, when Silas's voice rose loud enough to rattle the window panes over some grievance or another, it was Copper who rose first from his place by the hearth, and pressed himself bodily between Addie and the sound, not growling, never baring a tooth at the man who fed him, simply present, simply steady, until the storm blew past, and the house went quiet again. Ruth noticed it once, and said only that some animals seemed to know things people spent whole lifetimes refusing to learn. Ruth Whitcomb Merrick died in the January of Addie's 22nd year, of a lung sickness that took hold fast and did not let go, and it was at her mother's graveside, with snow still unmelted on the mound, that Addie understood how alone she truly was in that house, and how little time she had left to discover it. Silas Merrick did not wait a decent season to make his intentions known. Barely 8 weeks after Ruth was buried, he called Addie into the front room where his sons stood with their hats already in their hands, as though the matter had been settled before she was even asked to sit, and told her that the house and the acres and everything on them belonged, by law and by blood, to him and his boys, and that a stepdaughter, with no papers proving otherwise, had no more right to the property than a hired hand. He was not cruel in his words, which somehow made it worse. He spoke the way a man speaks when he has already decided something is simple arithmetic. He offered her 2 weeks to find a situation elsewhere, and the sum of $14, which he called generous, and which Addie understood, even then, to be exactly enough to make certain she left without a fight, and not 1 cent more. She packed what fit in a single canvas grip, her mother's awls and waxed thread, 2 dresses, a cracked hand mirror, a Bible with her mother's name inked inside the cover, and on the morning she walked down the lane for the last time, it was Copper who came without being called, falling into step at her heel as naturally as breath, as though he had always known this day was coming, and had simply been waiting for her to be ready. Before she left, she had gone once more to the little shop behind the house, now standing empty, and already half claimed by Silas's sons for tool storage, and taken only what was rightfully her mother's: the awls, the waxed thread, a single scarred leather form worn smooth by 2 generations of hands, and the small tin box where Ruth had kept the few coins she called her own. Silas's eldest son had watched her from the doorway without a word, and Addie had understood, in that silence, that he considered even this small taking a kind of theft, though it was in truth the only inheritance left to her. She did not cry until she was out of sight of the house. Then she cried the whole first mile, with her hand resting on the dog's warm red back, and somewhere in that mile, she made herself a promise that she would not spend the rest of her life being told what she was owed by men who had already decided the answer was nothing. The road to Larkspur Hollow ran 12 miles through frost-hardened wheat stubble and stands of bare cottonwood, and Addie walked every one of them on foot, her grip growing heavier with each mile, stopping twice to let Copper drink from half-frozen creek water, and once, near dusk, to share the last heel of bread between them on a fence rail, the 2 of them silhouetted against a sky gone the color of a healing bruise, purple and gold and bruised blue all at once, while somewhere behind them, the only home she had ever known went on standing exactly as it always had, indifferent to her leaving. Larkspur Hollow was the nearest town of any size. a rail spur settlement of some 400 souls tucked into a bend of the Sweetwater Fork, with a mercantile, a bank, a church with a leaning steeple, and streets that turned to soup every spring thaw. Addie arrived with 12 of her $14 already spent on a week's room above the seamstress's shop, and enough bread and coffee to keep herself and Copper fed, and she spent that week doing the only honest work she knew, mending harness and saddle leather for anyone willing to pay a few coins for it, sitting on an overturned crate in the alley behind the mercantile, with her awls spread on a scrap of canvas, and Copper stationed beside her like a sentry. She was good at the work, better, truthfully, than the harness maker, who had a proper shop on Main Street, and charged twice what she did, but goodness at a trade was not the same as having a roof, and by the 7th night, her coin purse held exactly $1, and the seamstress, kindly but firm, told her the room was needed for a paying boarder come Monday. It was old Mrs. Purdy at the mercantile, wrapping twine around a parcel, who mentioned almost as an aside, that the town was fixing to finally clear the old Vance livery stable off its books, since nobody in 9 years had wanted the cursed, half-collapsed thing, and the county would let it go for whatever a body cared to offer, if a body was fool enough to offer anything at all. Addie walked to the stable that same afternoon with Copper trotting at her heel, and found a building that most of Larkspur Hollow had long since stopped seeing at all, the way eyes slide past a thing too familiar and too ruined to be worth a second look. The roof sagged like a sway-backed horse, the double doors hung from a single hinge each, and inside, the stalls were choked with 9 winters of dust, and 9 summers of swallows' nests, the whole place smelling of mildew and old straw, and something colder underneath that Addie could not yet name. It was known, vaguely, unkindly, as Vance's Folly, named for Jedediah Vance, the liveryman who had built it with his own hands 20 years back, and who had, one autumn night 9 years before, simply vanished, leaving behind unpaid debts, a locked stable, and no explanation anyone in town had ever settled on. Some said he'd run off owing money, some said worse. Nobody had wanted to touch the place since, and the county clerk, a tired man named Hollis Beam, told Addie with something close to pity that she could have the deed for $1 even, building and half-acre lot both, and be doing the county a favor by taking it off the tax rolls. She walked the length of the place twice, boots crunching over broken glass and old straw gone to black rot in the corners, and found, beneath the ruin, good bones, thick cottonwood beams still sound despite the years, a stone foundation that had not shifted an inch, 6 stalls wide enough for good draft horses, and a loft that would make, with some patching, a perfectly serviceable place for a woman and a dog to sleep out of the weather. Addie thought of her mother's voice, "Nothing is finished being useful until somebody decides it is," and she thought of the $14 that had been meant to send her away quietly, and something stubborn and bright kindled in her chest. She paid her last dollar. Folks on the street shook their heads at the sight of it, a young woman with a dog and a canvas grip signing her name to a ruin nobody else would touch, and more than one voice called it a foolish waste of a girl's last coin, but Addie only tightened her grip on Copper's rope and told herself that $1 spent on a chance was worth more than $1 spent on nothing at all. She spent her first days simply making the place fit to sleep in, dragging out rotted straw and broken tack with her own 2 hands, propping the sagging doors with fence rails, sweeping 2 decades of dust from the loft where she meant to make her bed. Copper worked alongside her in his own fashion, nosing through the debris, chasing off the barn cats that had claimed the place as their own, and it was on the 3rd evening, with the light going gold and long through the gaps in the siding, that Addie noticed him behaving strangely toward the back corner stall, the one nearest the old tack room, pawing at a deep, undisturbed heap of ancient hay that had clearly not been touched since the day Vance disappeared. She called him off twice, thinking he'd caught the scent of a rat or a nesting bird, and twice he returned to the same spot, whining low in his throat, digging with a single-minded urgency she had never seen in him before, not even when chasing rabbits. On the third time, Addie knelt beside him with a lantern, more to satisfy her own curiosity than his, and saw that beneath the loose top layer, the hay had been packed hard and deliberate around something square and solid, as though it had been buried there on purpose rather than simply left to rot. Her fingers found a corner of old oiled canvas, and beneath that, wood. A chest, or a crate, sealed tight and clearly hidden with intention. Copper sat back on his haunches beside her, ears pricked, tail sweeping the dusty floor, watching her the way he always watched her when he had done something he was proud of, and Addie felt her heart begin to beat very fast indeed. It took her the better part of an hour, working by lantern light with a pry bar found rusting in the tack room, to loosen the crate from its nest of hardened straw, and when at last the lid gave way with a groan of old nails, what she found inside was not treasure in the way the penny novels would have promised, but something stranger, and in its own way, far more valuable. There was a ledger, its leather cover gone soft with damp, filled in a careful cramped hand with names Addie half recognized from around the county: Purdy, Ashcroft, Devereux, Ostrander, alongside sums of money, and dates going back nearly 15 years. There was a second, smaller bundle, wrapped in oilcloth, and when she unwound it with trembling fingers, she found a stack of land deeds, official-looking, county-sealed, bearing the names of a dozen different homestead families. All of them dated years before the present, all of them, she would soon come to understand, originals rather than copies. And tucked into a false bottom beneath the deeds, wrapped in a scrap of wool, was a leather purse heavy with old gold coin, perhaps $200 worth, more money than Addie had seen in her whole life put together. She sat back on her heels in that dusty stall with the lantern guttering and Copper's head heavy and warm against her knee, and understood, with a chill that had nothing to do with the coming night air, that Jedediah Vance had not run off owing debts at all. He had hidden something before he vanished, something he believed was worth hiding, and worth protecting, even at the cost of his own good name. It did not take Addie long, poring over that ledger by lamplight through the following days, to understand what she was holding, though the full shape of it only came clear once she began quietly asking questions in town, careful not to say what she had found. The names in the ledger matched, one for one, a dozen homestead families who had, over the past decade, lost their land claims to the Larkspur County Land and Trust, a bank founded and still run by a smooth, silver-templed man named Cornelius Pruitt, who had arrived in the territory some 15 years back as a land agent and had, family by family, discovered clerical errors and boundary disputes that always, without fail, resolved in the trust's favor, buying up the disputed acres afterward, at a fraction of their worth. Sympathetic and regretful each time. A man everyone in town called a pillar of the community. The original deeds in Addie's crate told a different story than the copies on file at the county courthouse. The copies, it seemed, that Pruitt himself had quietly altered years before. Boundary lines redrawn by a careful hand, signatures added where none had been given. Jedediah Vance, Addie came to learn from an old-timer named Ezra Colton, who remembered him fondly, had been Pruitt's clerk before he ever ran the livery, trusted enough to handle the county's paperwork, and honest enough, it seemed, to have copied out the true originals and hidden them the night he discovered what his employer had been doing, the same night he vanished from Larkspur Hollow and was never seen again. Whether Vance had fled in fear, or been made to disappear, nobody living could say for certain, and Addie found she could not think too long on that question without a cold unease settling over her. Tucked into the very last page of the ledger, in handwriting grown shakier than the rest, as though written in haste or in fear, Addie found a single line that she read a dozen times before she let herself believe it. If these papers are ever found, let them go to whoever finds them with an honest heart, for I could not carry them further myself. Beneath it, no signature, only the initials J.V., pressed so hard into the paper that the nib had nearly torn through. Addie sat with that line a long while, Copper's head warm against her knee, and felt the peculiar, humbling weight of being trusted, across 9 silent years, by a man she had never met, and would likely never be able to properly thank. What she could do, and what Copper's nose had made possible, was set right what Vance had died or disappeared trying to protect. She began, carefully and quietly, comparing each altered deed on file at the courthouse against its true original from the crate, cross-referencing them against the ledger's careful record of sums paid and land seized, building, stitch by patient stitch, the way her mother had taught her to build a whole harness from a heap of broken leather, an accounting of exactly how Cornelius Pruitt had spent 15 years quietly stealing the county out from under its own settlers. She worked in the evenings, after long days spent repairing the stable's roof and stalls with her own hands, taking in what harness mending work she could, to keep herself and Copper fed, so that by day, she was slowly, visibly, becoming Larkspur Hollow's newest tradeswoman, and by night, she was slowly, secretly, becoming its unlikeliest avenger. Copper never left her side through any of it, curled by the lamp while she worked, alert at the smallest sound from the road, and more than once, Addie found herself murmuring her plans aloud to him, as though he were her only trusted confidant, which in truth, for those first weeks, he very nearly was. It was inevitable that word would travel, in a town as small as Larkspur Hollow, that the Winslow girl was asking curious questions about old land claims, and inevitable too, that it would reach Cornelius Pruitt's ears, before Addie was fully ready for it to. He came to the stable himself, on a bright cold morning in late autumn, dressed as fine as a man of his standing always was, and stood in the wide-open doorway with a smile that did not reach his eyes, admiring, he said, how much she had accomplished with the old Vance place, and wondering, in the same breath, whether a young woman new to town might not find it wiser to leave old, closed matters closed. He offered, generously, he said, to buy the stable and its lot outright for $50, 50 times what she had paid, a sum that would have seemed a miracle to Addie only weeks before, and now struck her plainly as the price of her silence. When she declined, politely but without hesitation, his smile thinned, and he reminded her, almost gently, that a woman alone in a new town, with no family and no standing, might find herself short of friends, if she made herself troublesome to people of consequence. Copper, who had been lying quietly in the doorway sun, rose to his feet at the change in the man's tone, and stood close against Addie's leg, low and steady, not growling, not threatening, simply present, and Pruitt's gaze flicked to the dog for just a moment, before he tipped his hat and left without another word. In the weeks that followed, the pressure came in smaller, meaner ways than open threats. The bank called in a note on old Ezra Colton's cousin, quite suddenly, after 15 years of patient carrying. A rumor began circulating that the Winslow girl's stable was unsafe, unsanitary, a hazard the town council ought to condemn outright, a rumor Addie was fairly certain originated from Pruitt's own parlor. 2 customers who had promised her harness work found reasons to take their business elsewhere. Addie felt, for the first time since arriving in Larkspur Hollow, the old familiar sensation of being quietly, deliberately made smaller by a man who had already decided the answer to her existence was nothing, and it was that feeling, more than any other, that hardened her resolve rather than breaking it. One night, near the end of that hard stretch, a stranger's shape moved past the stable's rear window, well after midnight, footsteps deliberate and unhurried in the frozen mud, and it was Copper who woke her with a low, urgent bark. She had never heard from him before, placing himself squarely between Addie and the door, until the footsteps retreated the way they had come. She never learned for certain whose feet those were, though she had her suspicions, and after that night, she slept with the crate of deeds hidden beneath a loose floorboard, and Copper's rope tied loosely to her own wrist, so that neither of them would be caught unaware again. She thought, more than once in those uneasy nights, of walking away from the whole matter, of quietly selling the stable to Pruitt for his $50, and starting over somewhere he had never set foot. And each time, it was the memory of Vance's shaking, ink-torn initials that stopped her. The thought of a man who had given up everything to protect the truth, and asked nothing in return, but that someone, someday, finish what he started. She spent 3 sleepless nights finishing her accounting, matching every altered deed to its true original, every entry in Vance's ledger to a family still living in the county, who had never known the true reason their land had been taken. And on the 4th morning, she walked into the office of Judge Amos Kettering, the circuit judge who rode through Larkspur Hollow twice a year and happened, by great good fortune, to be in town that very week, with Copper at her heel, and a crate of proof under her arm. Judge Kettering was not a man easily impressed, but he was a careful reader of documents, and it took him the better part of a day, with 2 clerks and Addie herself walking him through Vance's ledger line by line, to satisfy himself that what he held in his hands was not a young woman's fancy, but a genuine, documented, 15-year fraud, complete with original deeds bearing county seals that could not be forged after the fact. He called for a public hearing to be held on the courthouse steps that Saturday, so that every family named in the ledger might hear the accounting for themselves, and word of it spread through Larkspur Hollow faster than any rumor Pruitt's parlor had ever produced. Pruitt himself arrived at that hearing still composed, still smiling the smile of a man who believed his standing would carry him through anything, right up until Judge Kettering read aloud, in a clear, carrying voice, the first altered boundary line beside its true original, and a murmur of recognition, and then anger moved through the crowd like wind through wheat. It was Ezra Colton's cousin who stood first, then the Ostranders, then the Devereaux family, each of them realizing in turn that the land they had grieved losing, the debts they had believed were their own failing, had in fact been engineered from the very start by the man standing before them in his fine coat. The wind that Saturday carried the first hard bite of true winter, and the courthouse steps were crowded shoulder to shoulder with farmers in patched coats, and their wives in shawls pulled tight, breath rising in pale clouds above the gathered crowd as Judge Kettering read the record on. Old Ezra Colton's cousin, a broad-weathered man named Silas Ostrander, who had not spoken above a mutter in Addie's hearing before that day, stood up so fast his chair scraped loud against the boards, and demanded to know, in a voice cracking with 15 years of swallowed grief, whether it was true that the debt that had cost his family their north pasture had never been a debt at all. When the judge confirmed it, reading the true deed aloud alongside the altered copy, so the whole crowd could hear the boundary lines diverge word for word, a low sound moved through the gathering that was not quite a cheer, and not quite a groan, something older and rawer than either, the sound of people finally hearing their own quiet suffering named aloud and given a shape. Pruitt tried once to speak over it, insisting the papers were forgeries, insisting a woman with no family and no standing could not be trusted to have found what she claimed to have found, and it was Addie herself who stepped forward then, Copper steady at her side, and asked the crowd plainly whether they trusted the seal of the county courthouse pressed into paper 20 years old, or the word of the man who had grown rich while their families grew poor. Copper, sensing the crowd's mood shifting like weather, pressed close against Addie's skirts, as the judge formally ordered the true deeds restored to the county record, and the fraudulent land and trust holdings frozen pending a full accounting, and Cornelius Pruitt, who had built his fortune believing no one would ever look closely enough to see it, was led away by the county sheriff, to answer for 15 years of quiet theft, his composure finally, thoroughly, broken. The restoration that followed was not instant, but it was real, and it was thorough. Over the following months, family by family, the true deeds were filed, the seized acres returned, and where land could not simply be handed back, sold on to other owners in the years since, the recovered gold from Vance's hidden purse, which Addie insisted from the very first day belonged to the wronged families, and not to herself, went toward settlements the judge oversaw personally. The Larkspur Hollow Livery, as Addie now called it, reopened its doors that same spring with a new roof, sound stalls, and a reputation that had traveled well beyond the county line. Not as Vance's Folly any longer, but as the place where a stubborn young woman and her red hound had uncovered 15 years of buried wrong and set it right, without asking for anything beyond what was fair. Farmers who had once shaken their heads at her foolish dollar now brought their finest harness work to her shop specifically, trusting the hands that had proven, in every sense, that they could be trusted with more than leather. And in a quiet corner of the county records, added at Judge Kettering's own insistence, was a note honoring the memory of Jedediah Vance, clerk and liveryman, who had risked and likely lost everything to protect the truth for 9 long years, until a dollar, a dog's nose, and a young woman with nothing left to lose finally finished the work he had started. Ezra Colton, in the spring following the hearing, planted a young cottonwood beside the stable's front doors in Vance's memory, saying it was only right that something of his should stand tall and living where his work had once been buried and forgotten, and Addie watered that young tree herself every evening for years afterward, copper stretched out in its thin new shade each summer, as though standing his own quiet watch over the memory of the man whose secret he had been the one to find. It is a strange thing, looking back on it now, how close the whole truth came to staying buried forever, beneath 9 winters of straw and silence, and how little separated ruin from restoration. $1, 1 dog's instinct, 1 woman who had been told her whole life that she was worth nothing, and chose, instead, to believe that nothing is finished being useful until somebody decides it is. Addie Winslow had arrived in Larkspur Hollow with $14 and a stepfather's contempt for a family history, and she left that first hard year as the keeper of the town's most trusted stable, and the reason a dozen families slept easy in homes that were, at long last, truly their own. Copper never did receive any medal or ribbon for his part in it, though the schoolchildren of Larkspur Hollow took to calling him the livery hound, and slipping him bacon rind whenever Addie brought him along to the mercantile, and Addie herself needed no medal either, only the quiet, settled knowledge that she had turned a cast-off girl and a condemned building into something the whole county now counted as worth keeping. We hope Addie and Copper's story stayed with you a little while after the telling, the way the best ones always do. If it did, we would be glad if you shared it with someone who might need reminding that value is often hiding in the places everyone else has stopped looking, and that a single dollar, spent with courage instead of despair, can sometimes buy back far more than anyone ever expected. We would love to know, what is the one thing in your own life that everyone else gave up on, but you never did? Tell us in the comments below, and thank you, truly, for spending this quiet hour with us. Until next time, stay close.